While Democrats are trying to figure out whether or not they want God in their platform, the IRS is trying to control what some pastors can say about the political issues that matter most to their congregations. An organization of lawyers called Alliance Defending Freedom is defending churches who are under investigation by the IRS for expressing their political views during their sermons. Now, they've marked October 7th as Pulpit Freedom Sunday to defy the IRS's censoring speech from the pulpit. Jim Garlow is pastor of the Skyline Church near San Diego. It's one of the largest churches in the country, and he joins me now. Jim, it's great to see you, and thanks for being here.
Good to be with you, Mike.
You know, Jim, it's a pretty bold thing to say on October the 7th, a bunch of pastors, hundreds, maybe thousands across the country, are going to stand in their pulpits and essentially say, the IRS can't tell us what we can or can't say. How did this come about?
Well, in July the 2nd, 1954, the Johnson Amendment was passed in the Senate. Now, there was no discussion of it, just a voice vote. But the result of it was that it began to put a muzzle on churches. We lost 166 years of freedom in the pulpit. So that's why the attorneys, 2,200 attorneys, rose up and are encouraging pastors to take a bold step and reclaim our biblical authority and our constitutional rights of the First Amendment, freedom of speech and freedom of religion. In 58 years since the Johnson Amendment, it has never been contested in court. There have been a lot of attempts to get it to court because the belief is it's unconstitutional, but we've not been successful. So the Alliance Defending Freedom asked pastors to begin defying the Johnson Amendment in their pulpits and record their sermons and mail them to the IRS. It started with 2008, 33 pastors. The next year, 84 pastors. The next year, 100 pastors. Last year, 539 pastors. This year, it'll be 1,000 or 2,000 pastors on the same day intentionally will exercise their biblical authority and constitutional rights and record their sermon, mail it to the IRS, and the attorneys are willing to defend us pro bono.
So has a church ever been shut down or a pastor been put in jail because he said something from the pulpit that the IRS deemed political?
In the 58-year history of the Johnson Amendment, no church has ever lost its tax exemption. There was one church that lost a tax exemption letter for a very short time, but that was for a completely different activity than what we're talking about in terms of freedom of speech and freedom of religion in the pulpit. No governmental intrusion in the pulpit is what we're advocating. But in 58 years, no church has lost its tax exemption. But the law hangs over us like a Damocles sword, in a sense chilling pastors, muzzling them, intimidating pastors. And the result is oftentimes pastors that try to be biblical and speak out on issues that are biblical. Tearing up a baby in the womb, for example, or the practice of homosexuality or the definition of marriage. People say, oh, you're too political, you're too political. No, we're simply being biblical, but people don't recognize biblical sermons anymore. That's the challenge, and that's why pastors are rising up and reclaiming that which is biblical as biblical and being bold in the pulpit.
So one of the arguments that will be thrown against you is you're tax exempt, so therefore you're getting a tax benefit from the federal government. You therefore have to bend to the federal government rules on what you can say and can't say. How do you respond to that argument, which is thrown at you, I'm sure, all the time?
Well, the assumption is that we entered into some kind of an agreement as pastors and said, okay, we'll not speak on so-called political issues for tax exemption. But that's not the way it happened. Our tax exemption as churches predated the IRS by a long time. The IRS has been around since about 1862. But our tax exemption as churches has been around since our founding fathers, because the founding fathers understood very clearly that what the government taxes, the government can control and the government can kill. So the proper definition of the separation of church and state is that the federal government has no government has any control at all over the church, over the pastor, over what's said in the pulpit. No governmental intrusion over the pulpit at all. So our whole notion of tax exemption comes from our founding fathers who understood the right definition of the separation of church and state.
Well, Jim, on October the 7th, sounds like there's going to be over 1,000 pastors across America, including you, that will stand in your pulpits and say whatever you wish to say. If you get in a lot of trouble, two things. One, come see us and talk about it. And number two, let me know. I'll come help bail you out. I'll do my best to get you out of the
Thank you, Sylvester. They can go to pulpitfreedom.org to find out more information about it.
Well, I hope folks will. And thanks so much for being here. It's going to be an interesting thing. You know, I think the simple reality that we all need to remember is that the very first line in the Bill of Rights is that Congress shall make no law. And then it goes on to describe what Congress can't do. It never says what churches can't do, never says what citizens can't do, never says what pastors can't do. It says what Congress cannot do. Yet they seem to be doing it anyway. Ought to be fun to watch on October the 7th. Glad to have Jim Garlow here.
Good being with you, my friend.
Thank you so much, Jim.